So in today's lesson, we'll be looking at the state of energy in the 21st century. The 20th century was dominated by fossil fuels, which helped fuel economic growth and development throughout the world. But with the ongoing effects of climate change and the increasing difficulty in securing fossil fuel reserves, energy leaders are having to look to new sources of energy to power our future. In order to better understand these issues, we will organize the lesson around the following key ideas. We'll start by asking the fundamental question of why energy matters and why we should care about this issue. Then we will look at how energy is generated today and what might be done to generate energy in the near future. Next, we'll be taking a closer look at Canada and how we produce energy now versus how we might do that in the future. And finally, we'll finish off by looking at energy issues in the developing world. Now, energy issues consistently rank near the top of Canadians' concerns according to a variety of polls. There's also a growing consensus among Canadians that we need to do more to balance our energy needs with the environment. A 2016 CBC Ecos research poll, for example, found that 72% of Canadians think the government should take action to protect the environment, even if it means increasing energy costs. And this is tied to the idea that our economy is transitioning from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy-based economy. We're having to find more and more sustainable sources of energy to power our future. And the reasons why fossil fuels are a concern are numerous. Fossil fuels are a non-renewable resource. They're not going to last forever. We might be only a few decades away from the point where we're not going to be able to rely on them to provide our energy. There's the political ramifications that come from importing oil from the Middle East, where there are huge reserves. Again, it's an area where there's lots of tensions, lots of geopolitical ramifications that come out of that, the economic concerns that come out of this, we should keep them all in mind. There are the environmental impacts of domestic oil. So thinking about the tar sands and the effects that they have in Alberta, as well as the ongoing debate in Canada regarding oil pipelines. And finally, fossil fuel use directly leads to climate change, so that by burning them, we're continuing to put more and more carbon in the atmosphere, which is making climate change worse, and again, increasing those impacts on all of us. We'll look more at oil issues in particular in a future lesson. Now, we know that we're in the process of transitioning from fossil fuels, but just where do we get all of our energy from anyways? Energy can be broadly divided between conventional and alternative sources of energy. Conventional sources are the ones that we've relied on for most of the 20th century, so fossil fuels as well as hydroelectric energy here in Canada. Alternative energy sources are just that, an alternative to those conventional sources. They're the ones that we can move towards in the 21st century. So these are things like nuclear energy, wind, solar, tidal power, and geothermal. Now, conventional and alternative sources can be either renewable or non-renewable in their own right, but alternative sources are mostly renewable, and all are more sustainable. We have the technology to do almost all of the alternative energy sources today, at this very moment. Some are still very expensive, though, although this is changing. Prices for wind and solar energy are rapidly falling and will soon be economically competitive with fossil fuels. Others come with their own risks. So nuclear power scares a lot of people because of the possibility of a nuclear disaster, like the ones we've seen in Chernobyl and Fukushima. And there's also the need to store nuclear waste for thousands of years before it's no longer dangerously radioactive. And although these are legitimate concerns, thinking about fossil fuels and the harm that they cause, if we were to take a purely statistical comparison of the two, there is far more disease caused by burning fossil fuels, respiratory infections, not even getting into the effects of climate change that are caused by fossil fuels, compared to the number of people who have ever fallen ill or been killed by nuclear energy, way more from fossil fuels. Other forms of alternative energy are still in the near future. So nuclear fusion, for example, is famous for being the energy source that was, quote unquote, 30 years away in the 1950s, and it's still, quote unquote, 30 years away today. although there are some encouraging signs that fusion may be doable in the not-too-distant future. So nuclear fusion, as opposed to fission, which is the current energy source that we use, fission is when we split apart a heavy atom, and the energy released from that is extremely immense. Fusion, on the other hand, is what the sun does. It's fusing two smaller atoms together, for example, two hydrogen atoms to create one helium atom. And this releases a lot more energy. It's a lot more energy efficient. If fusion becomes technologically and economically feasible, it could revolutionize society to an even greater degree than fossil fuels did, and change society in ways that are hard to even imagine today. So what we see from this list is that these are sources in the near future that we might be able to switch to, that in some cases might even provide greater energy benefits than we've seen from fossil fuels. And this is all very important because the world population needs an ever-increasing amount of energy to sustain our quality of life and development. For one, an expanding world population means that more energy is needed to provide for more people. Emerging industrial countries such as China, India, and Malaysia have standards of living that are becoming higher. So this increases their need for energy. And people in industrialized countries such as Canada and the US continue to use cheap energy to improve their standard of living. So all of these factors mean that the world is becoming more and more dependent on energy. We need more and more of it every year to fuel our lifestyles. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about how some of the energy issues could affect Canadians today. Now, Canadians use a lot of energy. In fact, Canada ranks second in the world in terms of energy use per person. Per capita, again, we're very similar to other industrialized nations, though. But there are certain things about Canada which make us a little more reliant on energy than some other countries. For one, Canada is a large country, and people are spread out. So we need to use energy to travel long distances or to transport goods long distances. We're located in a northern climate where it's very cold in the wintertime and hot in the summer. So we end up spending a lot of money to heat our homes in the winter and to cool them down in the summer. We're big consumers and we rely on fossil fuel powered vehicles. So great amounts of energy are required to manufacture and operate these goods. And finally, for us in Canada, energy is relatively cheap and plentiful, so we tend to waste it. And Canada is not an anomaly amongst developed nations. So this map here is showing what countries look like at night, and it's very easy to see where people in developed countries are living. The brighter you are, the more developed your population tends to be. There's a positive relationship between energy use and GDP. Now this is an issue we have to consider because as countries with large or rapidly growing populations continue to become more highly developed, their demands for energy will only increase. Middle developed countries like China and India are already quite noticeable on this map, even though they still have a lot of room to grow before they get to that highly developed stage. But getting back to Canada for a moment, most of our energy is still from non-renewable, conventional sources. We still rely on natural gas to heat our homes. We rely on gasoline to power our cars, and many provinces still operate coal power plants to generate a lot of their province's electricity. But this picture is quickly starting to change. Zooming in on Ontario, the province has phased out all coal generating stations. This began as a promise by the provincial Liberals under Dalton McGuinty in 2005, and by 2014, the last coal generating plant in Thunder Bay was decommissioned. In 2016, the federal government made a similar pledge, agreeing to phase out coal across the whole country by 2030. And the phase out of coal in Ontario has had some noticeable and significant short-term impacts. The GTA had long experienced smog days on hot summer days. A large contributor to the smog was the Nanticoke generating plant on the shores of Lake Erie. For a time, it was one of the top 10 carbon-producing sources in Canada. But since its shutdown, smog days in Toronto have virtually vanished. So even in the short term, this is having a positive environmental benefit on air quality. And so now in Ontario, we're relying more and more on alternative energy sources. So these two graphs here are comparing Ontario to the rest of the world. And as you can see on the right, the average place around the world still uses mostly fossil fuels to produce energy. But in Ontario, we're relying more and more on those alternative sources. So things like nuclear energy, hydroelectricity, as well as solar and wind power, which are growing. But this policy is not without its detractors. There's the rising electricity costs for households, and this is a real concern, but it's also important to think about the big picture. This is a change we're going to have to make eventually anyways. We can't rely on fossil fuels forever, and probably not even in the short term. So it's better to be ahead of the curve and to be a leader in sustainable energy technologies. There are things we can do to offset the short-term rise in energy costs, but over time, those energy costs should come down anyways as these alternative sources become more economically viable. And this in turn will ensure the long-term viability of energy in Ontario. There's a similar story for the rest of Canada in terms of energy. There's threats to maintaining our quality of life if we continue to rely on fossil fuels. Much of our current lifestyle and that of the developed world depends on the fact that we've always had abundant energy sources. The question is, will this always be the case? And again, some would argue that it will not. Many would, because of our reliance on fossil fuels, which may become scarce in our lifetime. And if we don't make a conscious decision to move away from those, we're going to see diminishing returns on fossil fuels. Others point to the need to switch to more sustainable forms of energy to meet our needs. But in the meantime, we need to do the following. We need to use our energy resources more efficiently and more wisely. And again, we need to gradually replace our use of non-renewable energy with more renewable sources. Now that we've looked at the energy story in Canada and other parts of the developed world, let's examine what's happening in the developing world. Developing countries are following a similar path to what was seen in the West in the 20th century. They're heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And this is a common trend. As countries develop, they have tended to become more and more dependent on fossil fuels to power their homes, their cars, and their businesses. So today, China is the world's leading consumer of coal. This is where a lot of their electricity is generated from. And 91% of India's energy comes from fossil fuels. In Beijing, many people wear breathing masks in public because the air quality is so bad. And in these countries, there's nowhere close to the same level of environmental regulation that we see in North America or in Europe. However, in some ways, these countries are ahead of some major countries, like Canada and the US, on renewable energy. China in particular is emerging as a world leader in renewable energy. They want to become less reliant on fossil fuels, and they want to improve their environmental standing. So in China, solar energy production has increased faster than fossil fuels in the past decade, and production of solar panels has increased 100 times in that time frame. Looking on the other hand at the least developed countries, we see a similar story. Many emerging African countries are turning to fossil fuels as a means to power their growing economies. And again, they view fossil fuels as a cheap but precarious fix. And they want to avoid impending economic problems that developing countries will face from declining oil reserves. Now, Africa has a huge natural advantage over other regions. Due to its climate and proximity to the equator, Africa is better positioned than other places to take advantage of solar energy. So this map here is showing the amount of solar radiation that different places in Africa get, and this is among the highest in the world. In fact, if we covered just over 1% of the Sahara Desert in solar panels, we would have enough energy to power the entire world. And we're starting to see progress with renewable energy sources in Africa. For example, Kenya leads the world in solar output per capita. Several Eastern African countries are turning to geothermal technology for power and to heat their homes. And although wind power is less evenly distributed, it is effectively used in some places like South Africa. So in summary, in today's lesson you learned that as global populations and economies develop, their demand for energy increases. Canadians use a lot of energy to heat our homes, drive our cars, and fuel our industries. Energy can come from either non-renewable sources such as fossil fuels or renewable sources like solar, wind, and tides. Most of our energy used to come from fossil fuels, but we are beginning to shift towards more sustainable sources. And developing countries are beginning to use more energy than before. Most start off burning fossil fuels, but some are beginning to turn to renewable sources.